Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie A Working Man, 2025, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. It's often said that the strength of a man isn't measured by the weight he can lift, but by what he chooses to carry. And A Working Man, a quiet, simmering drama from 2025, tells the story of a man who carries more than anyone should, while asking for nothing in return. It unfolds not with fire or fury, but with the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man walking into a storm with no umbrella, no armor, and no way to turn back. It's the kind of story that hums with quiet truth. No flashy heroes, no world-saving missions. Just one man, one job, and the aching reality of how hard it can be to survive when you're expected to be the one holding everything together. Directed by rising auteur James Latimer and starring the ever-resonant Jeffrey Wright, A Working Man doesn't just present a portrait of labor, it digs underneath it. Into the soil where dignity fights with exhaustion, where pride becomes a currency you spend sparingly, and where silence becomes the only safe language. This isn't just a film about blue-collar grit. It's a film about identity. About how we're seen, how we're ignored, and what we become when our usefulness fades. The story centers on Wendell Graves, a 58-year-old maintenance worker in a crumbling Midwestern factory town. He's a man you'd walk past on the street without a second glance. Clean boots, pressed shirt, toolbox in hand. Not loud, not flashy. A man who keeps machines running, who knows how to fix things no one else notices. For over 30 years, Wendell has clocked in before the sun rises and clocked out long after it sets, never late, never loud. But when the film opens, something's different. The factory is shutting down. Automation, they say. Restructuring. A better future, supposedly. For everyone except the people like Wendell, the ones with calloused hands, bad knees, and nowhere else to go. And it's in this slow collapse that the film finds its rhythm. It's not about the explosion, it's about the long, painful unraveling. The knowing that tomorrow might not come with a paycheck. That the hallway light you've walked under for 3 decades is being unscrewed in front of you. Wendell, ever composed, doesn't shout. He doesn't march or riot. He does what he's always done. He keeps working. Quietly. Dutifully. Even as the floor's empty. Even as his co-workers vanish. He starts fixing things that no longer need fixing. Cleaning machines that won't run again. Not because he thinks he'll be spared, but because he doesn't know how to stop. And it's that, his refusal to stop, that makes him the center of this haunting, meditative story. We meet other characters through Wendell's quiet orbit. His daughter Tasha, a teacher in the nearby city, who worries her father is slowly drifting into obsolescence. A young factory tech named Luis, who sees Wendell as both a relic and a mentor. There's June, the cafeteria worker who's watched everyone come and go for 20 years and seems to know every story before it's told. And then there's the company man, Clark, slick suit, smooth talk, eyes that never really look at anyone. He's the one delivering the bad news with a smile, promising severance and reskilling, and words that sound like empathy but land like concrete. But A Working Man isn't about pointing fingers. It's about tracing the human cost. It's in the quiet scene where Wendell walks through the abandoned locker room, running his hand along the row of names scratched into metal. It's in the way he presses his lunch pail closed with both hands, as if sealing away a part of himself. In how he sets his alarm every night, even after he's been told not to come in. There's a moment, simple but devastating, where Wendell finds a leaking pipe in the main boiler room, long after most of the crew's been laid off. No one's there to fix it. No one asked him to. But he lugs his toolbox up the stairs, crouches beside the hiss, and starts working. As the steam fogs his glasses, he smiles. Not because he's happy, but because, in that moment, he still matters. And it's this emotional terrain that gives the film its power. The way it captures grief, Not the loud kind, but the slow-burning grief of a man losing the thing that made him feel useful. It's the grief of erasure. And Jeffrey Wright plays it like a whisper, with eyes that say everything his mouth refuses to. Every line on his face feels earned. Every silence feels full. The film builds toward a quiet climax. After weeks of pretending he still has a job, Wendell's secret finally collapses. His daughter confronts him. The house is behind on payments. The car's been repoed. He's been living in his old work van, parking in the lot of the shuttered factory each night. There, surrounded by ghosts and rust, Wendell holds on to the last shred of who he was. But just when we think the story will drown in melancholy, it does something unexpected. It lets in light. A local mechanic, a woman named Darla, offers Wendell a job. Not because he needs charity, but because someone told her he was the best they'd ever worked with. The job is small. The pay is humble. But it's real. And Wendell, after everything, hesitates. Because starting over isn't just about work. It's about pride. About letting go of the identity you clung to for decades. And then he says yes. The final scene is just Wendell, underneath a busted engine, grease on his palms, radio humming in the background. He wipes his brow, smiles faintly, and keeps working. The screen fades. It's not triumphant. But it's honest. It's enough. A working man never tries to be a crowd pleaser. It doesn't spoon-feed resolution. It lets you sit in the complexity of labor, age, loss, and quiet perseverance. And for all its restraint, it hits harder than most films that scream. Because we know Wendell. He's our neighbor, our father, our uncle. He's every man who taught us how to hold a wrench, fix a door, carry burdens in silence. And in telling his story, the film doesn't just honor him, it honors all the ones we overlook. So, if you're drawn to cinema that slows down, that listens, that dares to look directly into the eyes of someone we too often pass by, A Working Man is that film. And it's not one you'll forget. Before the story begins to crack open, there is routine. There is the comforting rhythm of a life shaped by schedule, by alarms, by worn work boots, by the hiss of a coffee maker before the sun dares to rise. That's where we find Wendell Graves, each morning, dressed in layers not just of fabric but of years. He moves through his small kitchen like a man who doesn't question the purpose of habit. There's no hurry, but there's no hesitation either. It's Monday. Or maybe Thursday. It doesn't matter. It's a day to work. Like all the others before it. The world around Wendell is falling apart slowly. Not in grand collapses, but in the subtle erosion of what once felt permanent. Paint chipping off diner signs. More for lease notices in shop windows. Rows of houses with long-grown grass. He notices it all, though he never says a word. He drives the same route every day to Fulton Steel, a looming rust-red factory that once hummed with the music of industry. These days, it coughs and stutters, like an old man climbing stairs. Inside, the air carries the smell of oil, iron, and tiredness. It's a place where hands do the talking, and Wendells have learned every dialect of the machinery they tend to. He arrives early, always. Unlocks the maintenance cage, rolls up his sleeves. He doesn't need instructions. He's worked here for over 3 decades, seen it when it was alive, watched it grow quieter each year. But he never complained. Not even when his shift supervisor started dropping hints, small ones at first, like apologizing for fewer hours, or reminding Wendell that everything's moving digital now. The whispers of layoffs are just that for now, whispers. No one says anything outright. But the halls echo more than they used to, and some lockers haven't been opened in weeks. Still, Wendell works. Because that's what he knows how to do. One of the early scenes follows him through the long corridors of the plant, passing by idle equipment, checking bolts, tightening fixtures, wiping grease off surfaces no one else cares about anymore. There's a beauty in the way he moves, measured, intentional, respectful. He treats the machines like friends. He even talks to them sometimes. A valve hisses, and he replies, "I know, girl. I'll get to you in a second." It's endearing, but it's also revealing. In a world that has forgotten him, these machines remember. Wendell's life outside the factory is equally quiet. He lives alone in a small one-story house filled with memories, not cluttered, but lived in. Photographs of his late wife sit by the window. His daughter, Tasha, visits every Sunday, bringing groceries and fussing over his blood pressure. She works 2 towns over as a schoolteacher and worries about him more than she lets on. He always greets her with a smile, but he never talks about the fear growing behind his eyes, the fear of losing the last place where he knows who he is. In one of their early conversations, Tasha asks, "You ever think about retiring?" And Wendell, after a long pause, says, "Retire from what?" "From being me." It's not defiance. It's confusion. What would he be without this work? Without the steel and steam and the hum of pipes? She doesn't press him. But the question lingers. Things begin to shift when a new manager is introduced. Clark, mid-30s, confident, clean-shaven, with a clipped voice and corporate buzzwords that seem allergic to real emotion. He gathers the remaining staff in the cafeteria, maybe 24 workers now, and delivers the news. The plant is being bought out by an automation firm. Operations will continue during the transition, but within weeks, most positions will be eliminated. Clark thanks them for their years of dedicated service. He smiles. The words fall like ashes. Some shout. Some mutter. A few walk out. But Wendell just sits there, eyes fixed on the floor. It's not shock. It's confirmation. He's known this was coming. Not in detail, but in feeling. In the way the lights flicker and no one comes to fix them. In the way younger men leave for better jobs and aren't replaced. The world is moving on. And he is being left behind. But here's where the story tightens its grip. Instead of stepping back, Wendell steps in. He shows up for work the next morning as if nothing's changed. No one stops him. Clark's nowhere to be seen, and the few remaining floor workers just nod as he walks by. They respect him, rely on his quiet steadiness. And Wendell, perhaps out of habit or perhaps out of something deeper, keeps doing what he's always done. Inspecting equipment. Cleaning valves. Patching leaks that shouldn't matter anymore. He clocks in, even if the punch clock is cracked and forgotten. It's in these quiet days that we see the core of Wendell's world begin to unravel. He starts receiving notices in the mail, loan reminders, property tax increases, a letter from the energy company warning of overdue payments. He hides them under a stack of newspapers. Denial, perhaps, or just the belief that something will turn around. He has no savings to speak of, no pension worth clinging to. His pride keeps him from telling Tasha. He can't bear the thought of her seeing him as broken. Yet, even in the midst of this slow erosion, the film gives us glimmers of beauty. There's a scene where Wendell takes Luis, a younger apprentice with a restless energy, under his wing. Luis asks questions Wendell doesn't always answer directly, but he shows him everything. How to listen to a machine's hum to know what it needs, how to thread a pipe with your ears as much as your hands. Luis begins to see Wendell as more than just an old man. He sees a craftsman, a master. And through Luis's eyes, we see the poetry of Wendell's life, the grace in the small, skilled motions, the sacredness of maintenance. But even this bond is threatened. Luis is offered a job at a tech firm out of town. He's conflicted, but excited. He wants Wendell's blessing. And Wendell gives it, even though it quietly breaks something inside him. Luis thanks him, calls him the best teacher he's ever had, and leaves. And Wendell, after watching the young man drive off, returns to the factory and works the entire night. Alanites in these moments. Small, deliberate, that the film builds its tension. Not with action, but but with accumulation. The audience begins to feel the weight Wendell carries. Each step, each breath, each morning when he opens his toolbox not for a paycheck, but because he doesn't know how to be anything else. Then the storm arrives. Clark returns with a clipboard and a smile, and this time he has orders. The factory will be sealed within a week. Access will be restricted. Wendell's keycard is deactivated. The machines are being sold for scrap. And in a conversation so cold it burns, Clark says, "We appreciate your legacy here. But it's time to think about the future." Wendell doesn't reply. He doesn't plead. He simply nods, turns, and walks away. But something changes in him that day. He no longer waits for permission. He returns to the plant at night, using a spare key he's had for decades. He doesn't steal or sabotage. He walks the halls like a man saying goodbye, tightening bolts, oil cans in hand, fixing things that will never run again. It's not about rebellion. It's ritual. It's grief in the shape of labor. And when he returns home, the eviction notice is pinned to his door. The weight of it all, his job, his purpose, his home, collides in silence. But Wendell, ever composed, doesn't collapse. Not yet. Not here. He folds the notice, puts it in his shirt pocket, and keeps going. Because something inside him refuses to stop. And in that stillness, in that resolve, the second half of the story waits, just on the other side of that closed factory door. The factory gates stayed locked long after the sun came up, but Wendell stood outside them anyway, hands tucked in his jacket, the weight of silence pressing against his back like an old friend. There was no shift left to clock into, no machines humming beyond the walls, no voices echoing down the steel-wrapped corridors. Still he stood. Not because he thought someone would come open the doors, but because he didn't know what to do with a morning that didn't begin here. A week had passed since Clark delivered the final blow, the official shutdown, the sealed locks, the polite escort off the premises. Wendell hadn't told anyone about being evicted. His daughter, Tasha, still believed he was coming home each night, and for a while it had been true. But the power had gone out 2 days ago, and the refrigerator had started to hum like it was sighing in its sleep. Now he slept in his old van, parked just outside the fence line, near the back lot where the factory used to receive deliveries. He kept his toolbox beside him, even though there was nothing left to fix. But grief is a strange mechanic. It rewires you, slowly. And Wendell, despite everything falling apart, began to rebuild, not with hammer and nails, but with quiet rituals. At night, after the lot emptied and no one patrolled the fences anymore, he'd sneak inside. Not to vandalize. Not to steal. He swept floors. Retightened screws. Checked pressure gauges on dormant equipment. He made rounds like he used to, only now the only footsteps he heard were his own. It was madness, some might say. But Wendell wasn't unraveling. He was preserving. Then, one night, he found the water main flooding in the north wing. A pipe had burst, old from neglect, and the floor was slick with inches of rising water. Most would have walked away. But Wendell didn't. He found a wrench, tore off his jacket, and spent 2 hours in the dark patching the breach with scrap rubber and clamps. He soaked his sleeves, cut his knuckles, worked until his back ached and his hands bled. And when the water finally stopped, he sat on an overturned bucket and breathed in the damp silence like it was the only prayer he knew. The next morning, Darla showed up. She owned the auto shop on the far end of town, a small place filled with half-repaired cars and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. She'd heard about Wendell from Luis, who had already started his new job and felt guilty leaving his mentor behind. Darla wasn't looking to save anyone. She just needed help. Someone who understood engines the way others understood poetry. Luis had said, "Wendell's the guy," and so Darla, skeptical but curious, came looking. She found him sitting in the van, hands stained with grease, a thermos of cold coffee in his lap. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You looking for work or just passing time?" she asked. Wendell stared at her, unsure what to say. "I pay cash," she added. "Under the table. Ain't much, but I need someone who knows how to listen when the engine's talking." That line, "when the engine's talking," it caught something in him. A flicker. He agreed to stop by the next day. Darla's shop was nothing like the factory. It was loud, chaotic, too small for the number of vehicles crammed inside. But it breathed. It lived. And that first day, when Wendell bent under the hood of a '97 Chevy and diagnosed a dead belt by the sound of its struggle, he felt something unexpected. Purpose. He didn't say much. He never did. But he worked. And Darla, tough as the bolts she broke loose with her teeth clenched, watched him. Saw the rhythm in his hands. The patience. The way he treated each car like it had a name. She didn't compliment him. Not directly. But she started setting aside more complex jobs. She trusted him. And that meant more than any paycheck. Still, the wounds hadn't closed. At night, he still returned to the factory. Walked the empty halls. Not every night, but enough to keep the ghosts company. One evening, he found that someone had broken in. Teenagers, maybe, chasing thrills in an abandoned building. They'd knocked over shelves, sprayed graffiti across the control panel Wendell had maintained for years. He cleaned it all up. Alone. Angrily. Tenderly. And then he sat in the boiler room, in the one chair that hadn't been taken, and wept. He hadn't cried in decades. Not when his wife died. Not when the layoffs started. But that night, surrounded by broken pieces of a life that no longer fit together, he allowed himself to fall apart. It wasn't long after that when Tasha found out. She'd driven past the house on a weekday, noticed the overgrown lawn, the empty driveway. When she let herself in, she found the notices. The darkened kitchen. The silence. Panic bloomed in her chest, followed by betrayal. Why hadn't he said anything? Where had he been sleeping? What had he been eating? She found him at the auto shop the next day, halfway under a lifted Honda. They argued, not with shouting, but with sharp words and wounded eyes. "I could have helped," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't want help," he replied, wiping his hands. "I wanted to stay useful." And there it was, the truth beneath everything. He wasn't afraid of being broke. He was afraid of being invisible. Tasha didn't understand. Not fully. But she stayed. She sat with him during his lunch break. Brought sandwiches. Talked about her students. Their weekly visits became daily. She convinced him to move in with her temporarily. He resisted, but relented. Her small apartment didn't feel like home, but it was warm. And he stopped sleeping in the van. Still, the pull of the factory never left. One morning, Darla handed him a wrapped package. "Luis left this for you," she said. Inside was a framed photo, Wendell and Luis, side by side, under the massive steel frame of the old boiler. Someone had taken it before the plant shut down. On the bottom corner, Luis had written, "You kept it running. I won't forget." Wendell stared at the photo for a long time. Then, carefully, placed it beside the sink at Tasha's apartment. It was not the end of his grief, but it was the beginning of his peace. In the final act of the film, Wendell is offered a permanent position at Darla's shop. The pay's still modest, but the respect is real. He trains 2 younger mechanics. Teaches them how to listen. He starts fixing up his own old truck on the weekends, taking it apart and putting it back together. Not because he has to, but because he wants to. He finds rhythm again. A life that moves, even if the path has changed. The film ends the way it began, with a routine. Only this time, Wendell's routine starts not at the factory gates, but at the garage door of a place filled with life. He opens up, flips the sign to "Open," and sets a cup of coffee on the counter. A young mechanic walks in late, apologizing. Wendell hands him a wrench. "Better catch up," he says. "Engines don't fix themselves." And then, as the camera pulls back, we see the full works. Messy, noisy, alive. And so is Wendell. Not restored, not transformed, but still working. Still moving. Still here. Wendell Graves doesn't speak much, but everything about him tells a story. The way he folds his shirt just so before hanging it up, the gentle way he adjusts a wrench before tightening a bolt, the tired squint he gives the sky every morning as if checking whether the day is going to hold. He is a man sculpted by labor, carved into quiet purpose by years of fixing what others break. And yet, beneath all that practiced calm lies a man brimming with unspoken depth, grief, pride, stubbornness, and the aching kind of dignity that doesn't ask to be noticed. In A Working Man, Wendell is not the kind of character designed to impress. He doesn't enter with dramatic fanfare. He doesn't command the screen with grand speeches. Instead, he reveals himself in increments, like the slow dripping of water through a rusted pipe. And that's what makes him unforgettable. He's not trying to be a symbol. He simply is. A relic of a time that's fading. A craftsman in an age of automation. A man who has been reliable for so long that everyone, including himself, forgot to ask what happens when his reliability is no longer needed. He's defined by his rituals. The early mornings. The thermos filled with lukewarm coffee. The careful folding of his lunch in wax paper. These aren't quirks, they're acts of preservation. They are the structures that keep him upright when the world begins to tilt. Wendell's life is built on stability, on knowing that when he steps into his factory, the machines will be there, the walls will hum, and his purpose will click into place like a well-oiled gear. When that foundation begins to crack, so does something inside him. But the brilliance of Wendell's character is that his unraveling isn't explosive, it's internal. When his job is taken, he doesn't rage. He continues to show up. He continues to work, unpaid and unseen. He patches leaking pipes, tightens screws, tends to a dying building with the care of a man watering a graveyard garden. It's not delusion, it's devotion. He doesn't fix the machines because he thinks it will bring his job back. He fixes them because it's the only way he knows how to say, "I still exist." This deeply ingrained sense of duty is both his strength and his curse. It's what makes Wendell admirable, the kind of man others look up to, trust implicitly. But it also isolates him. His pride becomes a wall. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't tell his daughter he's been evicted, that the lights have gone out, that the home she grew up in is slipping away. He wants to protect her from the burden of his decline, and in doing so, he almost drowns in silence. His relationship with Tasha, his daughter, is the emotional core that reveals the tenderness Wendell tries so hard to hide. Their interactions are filled with layers, care laced with frustration, affection tangled with distance. Tasha is pragmatic, a teacher who believes in plans and structure. Wendell is instinct, muscle memory, and grit. They talk past each other often, but their love is unmistakable. It shows in the way Tasha keeps coming back, even when he shuts her out. And it shows in the way Wendell, despite all his resistance, allows her to pull him back toward something resembling home. Tasha is not just a secondary character. She is a mirror. Through her, we see what Wendell won't say. We see the fear in his eyes when she offers help. The quiet devastation when she learns the truth about his eviction. But we also see her resilience, her refusal to let her father vanish into himself. Tasha, in many ways, is Wendell's redeemer, not because she saves him, but because she sees him. And being seen, for a man like Wendell, is an act of grace. Then there's Darla, the mechanic who offers him work when no one else does. She's rough around the edges, pragmatic to the core, and allergic to sentimentality. But she understands Wendell in a way that others don't. Not because she coddles him, but because she respects his silence. Darla doesn't try to fix him. She just hands him a wrench and steps back. Their bond grows not through dialogue, but through work. Through shared silence, broken bolts, and the occasional nod that says more than words ever could. She represents a world that's moving forward, but one that still has room for hands like Wendell's. Luis, the young apprentice from the factory's final days, is the thread that connects Wendell's past to the future he never planned for. At first, Wendell sees him as just another kid with one foot out the door, more interested in tech than torque. But Luis listens. He learns. He absorbs everything Wendell offers, not just about machines, but about life. Their relationship is brief, but it becomes one of the film's most quietly profound arcs. Luis's success, his respect, becomes the proof that Wendell's work, his way, meant something. That he passed on more than knowledge. He passed on care. Even Clark, the corporate envoy of closure, is more than a villain. He's cold, sure. He smiles too much when delivering bad news. But he's not cruel. He's just from a different world, a world that doesn't know what to do with men like Wendell. He sees numbers, projections, efficiency. Wendell sees people. Machines that breathe. The chasm between them isn't malice, it's disconnect. Clark isn't there to hurt Wendell. But he does. And the tragedy is that he'll never understand how deeply. Wendell's character arc is not a revolution, it's a reclamation. He doesn't change dramatically. He doesn't rise to lead a protest or dismantle the system. But he does make a choice. When offered a new job by Darla, he hesitates. Pride claws at him. Fear whispers. But he says yes. And in that yes, he reclaims something essential. Not his old life. But his worth. By the film's end, Wendell is still quiet. Still steady. But lighter. His silences aren't as heavy. His hands still move with care, but they no longer tremble under the weight of being the last of his kind. He's found a new place, not as a hero, not as a legend, but as a man who still matters. A man who teaches, who works, who wakes up each morning with something to do and someone who needs him. And that is the quiet triumph of Wendell Graves. He may not have changed the world. But he changed himself. One bolt at a time. It didn't take long for the people on set to realize they were making something different. Not loud. Not flashy. But something that lived in the quiet corners of real life. A working man wasn't filled with explosions or sprawling green screens. It didn't have the adrenaline of a car chase or the showy pulse of a big-name franchise. What it had was weight. Stillness. And a man whose silence said more than any monologue ever could. But behind that silence, behind the soft atmospheric hum of the finished film, the production itself carried a series of strange, fascinating, and at times unexpectedly emotional twists, moments that, much like the story itself, were tucked into the background until you looked just a little closer. The script had been floating around for years before it found a home. Written by screenwriter Jonah Elsby, it was originally titled Graveshift, a play on both the main character's surname and his night maintenance job. But studios passed on it again and again. Too slow, they said. Too small. That is, until it landed on the desk of director James Latimer, known for his quiet character dramas and obsession with Rust Belt Americana. He read it in one sitting and, according to crew legend, didn't even finish his coffee before calling to buy the rights. It felt like reading my father's life on paper, he later said in an interview. I didn't need explosions. I needed truth. The first strange fact, the factory in the film is real. Fully real. Abandoned just 6 months before production began, the Northwood manufacturing plant in western Ohio had been shut down due to budget cuts and shifting overseas contracts. Most of the equipment was still intact, layered in a soft blanket of dust and time. The production team, instead of building sets, worked with what was already there. They cleaned just enough to make it safe, but left much of the decay untouched, cracked linoleum, rusted stairwells, faded locker tags still bearing names long forgotten. The eerie authenticity of the location meant they barely had to design anything. It felt haunted, one grip said. Not by ghosts, but by people who just never got to say goodbye. During pre-production, the crew uncovered a sealed filing room behind a rusted panel in the north wing. Inside were documents, time cards, payroll slips, and photographs from decades past. Rather than discard them, director Latimer made them part of the film's texture. If you look closely in the background of Wendell's maintenance office, you'll see some of those original photos tacked to the wall. In one chilling instance, one of the extras, a local man hired to play a factory worker, found a picture of his uncle among them. "He used to work here," the man said, tears catching in his throat. "I hadn't seen his face in years." That wasn't the only time truth and fiction blurred. The casting of Jeffrey Wright as Wendell came after months of deliberation. Latimer was hesitant at first. Not because Wright wasn't a fit, but because he was worried he'd be too good. Jeffrey has this way of bringing a character to life so completely, you forget you're watching fiction, Latimer said. "I didn't want to lose the realism in perfection." But once Wright stepped on set in full costume, his uniform slightly worn, his shoes scuffed, his thermos tucked under one arm, there were no doubts. From day one, extras and crew members began referring to him as Wendell, not Jeffrey. Wright took the role with a level of commitment that bordered on the mystical. He chose to live alone in a rented trailer near the real factory for the entire shoot. No driver. No assistants. Just him and a notebook. He would walk to set every morning at dawn, toolbox in hand, already in character. Crew members say he refused to speak out of character during filming hours, and would often be found on set long after wrap, tightening bolts on real pipes, sweeping corners no one would ever see on screen. That obsession with realism extended to his tools. Wright didn't want props, he wanted function. The production team filled his toolbox with genuine, era-accurate wrenches, tape, clamps, and oil cans. One of the film's most poignant scenes, a pipe bursting late at night, was unscripted. It happened during a tech check. A water main unexpectedly ruptured in the old factory, and instead of calling cut, Wright dropped to his knees and began working on it in character. Latimer had the camera rolling, and the footage was so raw, so emotionally honest, that they wrote it into the film the next day. Another quietly strange element of the shoot involved sound. To preserve the authenticity of the factory's echo and ambient hum, the sound department opted to use live location audio rather than dubbing in effects later. But here's the twist. As it turns out, the factory itself had its own voice. Certain pipes would moan at specific hours. Floor tiles would groan in a pattern. By week 2, sound engineer Marta Glenn noticed the building seemed to respond when actors entered. She recorded these occurrences, layering them under the film's actual scenes. If you listen closely, really closely, you might hear it. The creaking rhythm of a place that was once alive, remembering. There were stranger moments still. During one rainy day shoot in the parking lot, an elderly man walked onto set unannounced. Security moved toward him, but the man held up his hand and said, "I worked here for 40 years. That you're Wendell." He pointed to Wright, who was sitting silently in his van, waiting for his cue. When the man approached, Wright stepped out without a word, shook his hand, and nodded. No words were exchanged. Just a moment between two working men, one real, one imagined, bound by the same silent dignity. The film's budget was modest, $4 million, most of it going to cast and on-location logistics. But one odd expense stood out, the purchase of an antique lunch pail from the 1960s. Wright had insisted on using one he saw in an old photo during his research, convinced it would help him feel the weight of a life. The art department scoured estate sales and collectors' forums until they found one nearly identical. It appears in almost every scene Wright is in, worn like a shield, carried like a relic. As for the van Wendell sleeps in, it wasn't scripted that way. During scouting, Latimer stumbled upon the rusted vehicle in a nearby field and fell in love with it. The production bought it for $500, cleaned it just enough to be safe, and rewrote a chunk of the story around it. Wright actually slept in it for 3 nights to better understand the solitude of his character's descent. "There's a loneliness that you don't feel until you sleep in the shell of your own failure," he later said. The weather, too, played its part. Production was scheduled for 6 weeks, shooting primarily during the fall. But the weather in Ohio refused to cooperate. Rain fell nearly every other day, coating the factory windows in streaks, pooling in the corners of old rooms. Instead of fighting it, Latimer leaned in. He added scenes. The rain became a motif, a cleansing, a soft cry from the world that mirrored Wendell's emotional state. By the time the film was complete, nearly a third of its exterior scenes featured rain, and not a drop was planned. And then there was the coffee. Throughout the film, Wendell drinks from a battered silver thermos. What viewers don't know is that it always contained real coffee, strong, black, and made by Wright himself every morning before sunrise. He said it helped him become Wendell, one PA recalled. And the truth is, it smelled like Wendell. That coffee had its own performance. Even the end of the shoot brought an odd but beautiful twist. On the final day, after the last scene had wrapped, Wendell handing a wrench to a younger mechanic in Darla's shop, the cast and crew gathered for a small wrap celebration inside the factory. Wright stood silently by the boiler room where so much of the story had taken shape. Then, without prompting, one of the electricians picked up a wrench, placed it on the ground, and said, "Leave it here." For him. Others followed. A pair of gloves. A flashlight. A folded rag. They left them not as props, but as offerings. Not to a character, but to a spirit. The spirit of every person who's worked a job the world forgot, and kept showing up anyway. Some say the factory still holds those items, undisturbed. The building remains sealed now, quiet again. But for those 6 weeks in the fall, it breathed once more. And Wendell, whether real or not, walked its halls. There's a moment in A Working Man, subtle, almost invisible, when the camera lingers just a little longer on Wendell's hands than you expect it to. They're not trembling, not doing anything dramatic. Just resting on his lunch pail, worn and weathered like they've been holding onto that same shape for decades. But in that stillness, something shifts. You realize this isn't just a character. This is a man whose world has been held together by habit, by the comfort of routine. And now, in the quietest way imaginable, it's unraveling. Critics didn't all agree on the film's pacing. Some called it glacial. Others said it breathed like real life. But most could not deny the emotional gravity it carried, the way it refused to flinch, to pander, to tell you how to feel. Instead, it sat with its audience, hand on shoulder, silent but unwavering. And maybe that's what made the film so haunting. Its refusal to entertain for entertainment's sake. It wasn't made to dazzle. It was made to remember. One of the most significant events in the film, from a structural and thematic standpoint, is the moment Wendell continues to show up for work even after he's been let go. It's not played as a punchline or a delusional breakdown. It's played as an act of mourning. He sweeps floors, checks gauges, cleans tools no one will ever touch again. And in doing so, he performs a kind of sacred ritual. Critics from The Guardian and IndieWire pointed out how this choice subverted expectations. Instead of a rage-filled outburst or a sudden shift toward political rebellion, we get something more disquieting, quiet perseverance. Wendell doesn't protest because he doesn't know how not to work, one reviewer wrote. And that, in itself, is a tragedy. The factory, now empty and echoing, becomes a cathedral of memory. It's not just a building, it's a reflection of Wendell's inner life. Each hallway is a decade, each machine a scar. And as he moves through it, the viewer sees not just a man in a place, but a man becoming the place. The cinematography leans into this metaphor, Shadows cling to Wendell like smoke, the camera framing him as part of the infrastructure, like a living bolt in a dying machine. It's claustrophobic and expansive all at once. Critics praised the use of space as narrative. The New Yorker described the film as a symphony of silence, conducted in the corridors of collapse. Another pivotal moment, the burst pipe in the boiler room, is not just a plot device. It's a turning point. On the surface, it's simple. A pipe breaks, Wendell fixes it. But critically, it represents everything the film is trying to say. No one told him to fix it. No one is watching. No one even knows the water is rushing across the floor. But he does it anyway. Because to Wendell, doing the work is the same as being alive. Several essays on the film picked up on this. One writer for Sight and Sound described it as cinema's quietest act of heroism since George Bailey chose to stay in Bedford Falls. The moment where Wendell sleeps in his van, parked just outside the shuttered factory, drew widespread discussion. It's painful in its simplicity. He eats cold meals, stares at the windshield fogging with breath, plays an old gospel tape and lets it loop until it clicks off into silence. The van becomes both coffin and cradle, a symbol of the life he refuses to abandon, and the space where he is forced to admit it's already gone. Film scholars noted the significance of this confinement. It's a space where dignity and decay coexist. The Los Angeles Times wrote, "It's not homelessness the film is portraying. It's home lost to obsolescence." Wendell's relationship with his daughter Tasha is another rich vein for analysis. Critics noted the generational tension, how her world of lesson plans and digital convenience clashes with his analog spirit. But more importantly, they saw their dynamic as a conversation between eras. Tasha represents a future that tries to care but doesn't know how to reach back without stepping forward. Her frustration with Wendell isn't disrespect, it's fear. She sees her father fading before her eyes, swallowed by a system that no longer values what he offers. Their most emotional exchange, when she finds out he's been sleeping in the van, became a highlight in nearly every critical review. "This scene hits like a confession whispered in a church," said one critic. "It's not loud, but it shatters you." Darla, too, became a focus for those dissecting the film's themes. She's not romanticized. She's brusque, impatient, even skeptical of Wendell at first. But she becomes a foil, not a savior, but a bridge. She sees value in him not because of sentiment, but because of need. She gives him a place not out of pity, but out of recognition. Critics loved this. "Darla isn't there to redeem Wendell," wrote Paste magazine. "She's there to acknowledge him." And in a film about invisibility, that's an act of love. Luis, the young apprentice who leaves for better prospects, also sparked discussion. His departure is handled without drama, but its impact is seismic. Wendell gives him his blessing, even as the loneliness wells up behind his eyes. It's a passing of the torch without ceremony. But critics noticed the elegance in this moment. One article called it an unspoken graduation, where Wendell watches a part of himself walk away and chooses not to hold it back. "He lets Luis go because he must," the piece read. And in doing so, he affirms that his legacy will not end with the locks on the factory doors. The final act of the film, the quiet decision to start anew at Darla's shop, was, unsurprisingly, the subject of rich critical discourse. Some saw it as hopeful. Others, more cynical, saw it as a concession. But almost all agreed it was earned. The final scene, where Wendell opens the garage, flips the sign to open, and hands a wrench to a young apprentice, felt like closure without finality. The world hasn't changed. But Wendell has. He's not fixed. But he's still working. And that, for many viewers, was enough. Perhaps what critics admired most about A Working Man was its refusal to moralize. There's no villain here. Not even Clark, the corporate face of the shutdown, is painted with cartoonish cruelty. He's just a man doing his job, trained to speak in spreadsheets and efficiencies. The film doesn't excuse the system, it just shows its cost. And in doing so, it invites the viewer not to judge, but to understand. Some of the most poignant critical reflections focused on the film's thematic resonance in a post-pandemic world. After years of remote work, labor shortages, and redefined values around essential workers, Wendell's story felt like a reckoning. A love letter. A cautionary tale. As one reviewer said, this film doesn't scream about what we lost. It whispers it. And that whisper lingers longer than a shout ever could. Thematically, A Working Man is a story of erosion, not just of jobs, but of self-worth, of visibility, of structure. And yet, it's also a story of redefinition, of how identity, even when stripped down to its foundation, can still be rebuilt. It doesn't offer revolution. It offers resilience. The film's critical reception was deeply divided along generational lines. Older critics, especially those familiar with blue-collar culture, saw it as a deeply personal elegy. Younger audiences found it melancholic, sometimes painfully so. But across both spectrums, there was admiration for its commitment to authenticity. There are no shortcuts here. No easy wins. Just one man, day by day, choosing to keep going. In post-screening discussions, many viewers shared stories of their own fathers, uncles, neighbors, men who'd lost factories, fields, construction sites. Men who taught them to work with their hands. The film became a conduit for grief and gratitude. Some cried. Some left in silence. One man, according to a Q&A attendee, whispered as he walked out, "That was my dad. That was all of him." In the end, A Working Man is not a film that leaves you with answers. It leaves you with questions. About how we define purpose. About the quiet damage of being forgotten. About how deeply the soul is tied to work, not as paycheck, but as presence. And about what it means to be useful, even in a world that's replaced you with wires and screens. Critically, its impact wasn't in numbers or awards, though it gathered plenty of nominations and swept several indie festivals. Its impact was in the way people spoke about it afterward. In the way conversations shifted. In how suddenly, the small, calloused hands of working men and women felt just a little more visible. And that, perhaps, is the film's greatest accomplishment. It didn't shout for attention. It reminded you to look at what's been there all along. They didn't build the world of a working man. They found it. That's how director James Latimer explained it when asked how the haunting realism of the film came to life. Not from sound stages or green screens or carefully assembled studio backlots, but from a real place, already etched with time, with grit, with memory. A forgotten factory in a forgotten town. The kind of place you drive past without turning your head. The kind of place where men like Wendell Graves used to wake up at 4 a.m., pour coffee into thermoses, and clock in long before the sun had stretched across the rusted rooftop. The story of A Working Man began not on the page, but in a diner. Or at least, that's what the crew liked to say. Jonah Elsby, the screenwriter, had been traveling through the Midwest on a train, tracing old industrial routes for a separate project. One rainy morning in Indiana, he stepped into a diner and saw a man sitting alone with his overalls still damp from the morning dew, staring at a rusted steel plant across the street that had clearly shut down long ago. No tears. No emotion. Just a look that said, "That was mine. That was me." Jonah never forgot that look. Months later, Wendell Graves was born. When production finally got off the ground, it was modest. A $4 million budget. A tight 6-week shooting schedule. A skeleton crew. But what it lacked in scale, it made up for in soul. And at the heart of it was the decision to shoot in the Northwood manufacturing plant, a real-life steel facility in Ohio that had closed less than a year earlier. The place was intact, barely. Rust crawled up the beams. The locker room smelled of dust and lost time. Old shift schedules still clung to corkboards. and the crew, upon first stepping inside, went silent. Cinematographer Iris Monroe later said it felt like stepping into a mausoleum. Everything we needed was already there, the ghosts, the echoes, the grime. We just had to respect it. And they did. Instead of repainting or reconstructing, they filmed it as they found it. The flickering lights? Real. The groaning pipes? Untouched. Even the steam that curled from the factory's rusted vents wasn't a special effect. The heating system, bizarrely, still sputtered to life during cold mornings, providing the perfect backdrop for the film's colder, more solitary scenes. One of the most fascinating decisions made during production was to shoot entirely chronologically. Latimer, drawing inspiration from filmmakers like Mike Leigh and Ken Loach, believed that the emotional journey of the film would only feel authentic if the actors experienced it in sequence. That meant as the factory's emptiness grew on screen, it grew on set. Lockers were emptied as filming progressed. Extras were phased out, one by one. The noise lessened with each day. By the final week, only a few crew members remained in the main plant. The silence was deafening. And real. Jeffrey Wright, cast as Wendell, took his method to another level. He arrived 2 weeks before shooting and moved into a rented trailer near the factory. No handlers. No team. Just him, a notebook, and a toolbox he insisted be filled with real tools. On the first day of shooting, he refused to be driven. He walked to set in the early dark, steel-toed boots crunching gravel. "I needed to feel the weight of those mornings," he said. The repetition. The aloneness. That authenticity extended into his performance in ways the crew never expected. On day 7, a minor electrical fire broke out in the break room when an old fuse shorted. Before anyone could react, Wright calmly stepped in, as Wendell, and shut off the master breaker, checking the panel like he'd worked there all his life. Afterward, the fire marshal asked which crew member had done it. "That wasn't crew," someone said. "That was the lead." Director Latimer was known for his spontaneity, and on more than one occasion, entire scenes were reworked on the fly. The now iconic moment where Wendell finds the flooded boiler room wasn't in the original script. It came about when a frozen pipe actually burst during an overnight shoot. Rather than delay production, Latimer whispered to Wright, "Go to it. Be Wendell." Cameras rolled. What followed was a single-take scene of quiet, relentless work. No music, no dialogue, just a man and a wrench. That raw footage became one of the film's most talked-about moments. The town, too, plays a quiet role. It's not bustling with caricatures or colorful side characters. It's subdued, like the film. A diner with a flickering sign. A post office with an overworked clerk. Rows of empty houses with cracked paint and sagging porches. But it's not presented as miserable. Just tired. Honest. The way Latimer films these places makes you believe in them. Not as backdrops, but as truths. You've been to this town. Maybe you grew up there. Maybe your father did. Maybe you pass through it every day without realizing. Then comes Darla's shop. The auto garage where Wendell finds something resembling a second act. It's a contrast to the factory, but not a jarring one. Where the factory is vast and ghostly, Darla's shop is compact and alive. Tools hang like instruments in a musician's studio. The lighting is harsher, more direct. But there's energy here. People moving, grease-streaked rags tossed over shoulders, radios humming softly in the background. When Wendell first steps into this space, the camera lingers, not on his face, but on his hands, twitching slightly as they take in the new terrain. A new battlefield. A new altar. The way Monroe captures his integration into this space is brilliant. Slowly, she shifts the framing to include him more centrally. The angles become tighter, more confident. The lighting on Wendell becomes less diffused, sharper, as if he's becoming visible again, for the first time in a long time. It's not about victory. It's about visibility. Sound plays a crucial role in the film's atmosphere. There's no traditional score, no swelling orchestra to guide your emotions. Instead, you get the music of real places. The clang of a dropped wrench. The hum of a machine that's still fighting to live. The sigh of a chair as Wendell settles into it after a long day. The silence, when it comes, is never empty. It's always full. The most emotional scenes often feature no dialogue at all. Just space. The sound of a man trying to breathe through grief without letting anyone hear it. The one piece of music that is used, a warbled gospel song from an old cassette tape, becomes a kind of emotional compass. It plays faintly in the van. In the background during a cold evening. It's never loud. But it's always there, threading Wendell's past to his present. The film doesn't use music to tell you what to feel. It uses silence to let you discover it on your own. There's a scene near the end, simple, quiet, that many critics and viewers remembered long after the credits rolled. Wendell, having accepted the job at Darla's, arrives early one morning. The garage is still locked. The sky is gray. The camera doesn't cut. It holds. We watch him stand there. The wind rustling his coat. His breath visible in the cold air. He places his hand on the door, not to knock, but just to feel it. To let it know he's there. It's a moment that says everything without a single word. He belongs here now. That moment would never have worked on a constructed set. It needed the creaking door. The chipped paint. The sidewalk that sloped slightly left because the concrete had settled unevenly decades ago. It needed to feel like a place that had existed long before Wendell arrived, and would continue to exist long after. The brilliance of A Working Man is that its setting isn't designed to impress. It's designed to serve. To sit behind the character like a faithful shadow. It enhances the mood not through grandeur, but through texture. Through restraint. Every choice, every color, every sound, every frame, is made in service to Wendell's journey. In the end, the film doesn't leave you with the sense of a story that happened in a place. It leaves you with the feeling that this place was the story. That the factory, the van, the shop, the streets, they weren't just backdrops. They were witnesses. And they'll remember him, even if no one else does. You wouldn't have known you were walking onto a film set. Not at first. There were no bright floodlights glaring into the sky. No trailers lined up like silver dominoes, no PAs barking into walkies. What you had was quiet. Frosted breath in the early morning. The creak of a metal door reluctantly opening. The scent of rust and old oil in the air. A Working Man wasn't made on a bustling soundstage in a city. It was made in the bones of something once real, an old, decommissioned factory in western Ohio that had seen more goodbyes than cameras. And it was within those walls that something rare happened. The cast and crew didn't just make a movie. They became a kind of family. It started with the factory itself, which the crew referred to as the cave. Cold, damp, and echoing like a cathedral stripped of its pews, the Northwood manufacturing plant was equal parts intimidating and sacred. When production designer Maya Rhodes stepped inside for the first time, she reportedly said, "We don't need to build anything. The ghosts already did it." The crew agreed. Very little set dressing was required. Most of what you see on screen, faded safety posters, scratched lockers, old time cards, were all left behind by real workers who hadn't returned since the shutdown a year earlier. Jeffrey Wright arrived in town 2 weeks before production began. No press. No handlers. Just a duffel bag, a dog-eared copy of the script, and a determination to disappear into Wendell Graves. He asked not to be called by his real name during shooting hours. To the crew, he was Wendell from day one. He requested to be put up not in a hotel but in a modest rented trailer near the edge of the factory grounds, next to a little gravel lot that became the perfect stand-in for Wendell's late-night parking spots in the film. Wright would wake before anyone else and walk to set alone in the pre-dawn chill, lunch pail in hand. It didn't take long for the crew to start following his rhythm. "We weren't just filming a movie," said First Assistant Director Carla Jennings. "We were entering his world. And to respect that, everyone showed up early. Everyone stayed quiet. You didn't blast music on set. You didn't joke between takes. You moved like you were part of the machinery. It wasn't a rule, it was an energy. Everyone felt it. But that doesn't mean it was all solemn faces and silence. There were moments of levity, too, little sparks of life that broke through the cold. One day, while setting up a particularly long tracking shot through a maze of old machinery, the dolly operator, known affectionately as Big Mike, accidentally left his lunch perched on the track. When they called action, the camera smoothly rolled forward, only to crash gently into a neatly wrapped BLT. The take was ruined, but laughter erupted through the cavernous space. Even Wright cracked a smile, breaking character just long enough to joke, "Guess Wendell's got competition now." That factory played tricks on people, though. The supporting cast brought their own kind of magic. Olivia Monette, who played Darla, the shop owner, was known for her roles in comedies and indie romances. But she came to set with steel in her eyes. She spent weeks learning real mechanical work from a woman-owned garage in Cincinnati, determined to make Darla more than a stereotype. On one occasion, she surprised the crew by rebuilding part of a carburetor between takes. "She came in all fire and grit," said Latimer, "and gave the film its backbone." One of the more unusual details: every car in Darla's shop belonged to a real resident of the town. In exchange for permission to film in the area, the production offered free tune-ups to locals whose vehicles appeared on screen. This created an odd but wonderful side effect. People in the town began driving by the set just to see if their cars would make the cut. At one point, they had to hire someone to direct traffic outside the garage just to keep curious neighbors from wandering into frame. Then there was the music, or the lack of it. For the majority of the film, there's no score. That was deliberate. Sound designer Rachel Ng believed the factory had its own music, its creaks, its hisses, its low groans. Instead of composing traditional cues, she recorded ambient noises during off-hours, layering them with sub-bass frequencies to create a soundscape that hummed beneath scenes like a forgotten memory. But the real stroke of genius came in the final act. Wendell's old gospel tape, the one he plays over and over in his van, wasn't a prop. It was a real cassette, discovered by the art team in a box of abandoned items from the factory's Lost and Found. Latimer loved it so much, he bought the rights to the song. The warbled vocals, the barely there organ, the static, it all stayed. It became the heartbeat of Wendell's private world. Of course, not every moment was poetic. The shoot was grueling. They battled unpredictable weather, including a 3-day ice storm that shut down power and delayed filming. On one occasion, an overzealous PA accidentally locked Jeffrey right inside the break room for almost 2 hours before realizing he was missing. When they finally opened the door, they found him sitting in a folding chair, sipping cold coffee, muttering lines to himself. "You okay?" they asked. He looked up and said, "I think Wendell needed that." Despite its modest scope, the film became something of a local legend. Residents began leaving tokens on the factory fence: old gloves, hard hats, handwritten notes. One simply read, "For the ones who kept showing up." Those words were later worked into the film's end credits, appearing subtly on a clipboard behind Wendell's final scene. The final day of shooting ended not with a champagne toast, but with a shared silence. The crew gathered in the darkened factory one last time. The lights dimmed. A few candles flickered on old workbenches. Latimer gave no speech. Instead, he simply turned to Wright and said, "Clock out." And Wright, with all the weight of Wendell in his bones, walked to the old punch card wall and slid one final card into the machine. Click. And that was it. The card remains there today, framed in glass, mounted beside the factory's sealed front doors. It reads, "Wendell Graves. Final shift." The world of a working man doesn't unfold like a stage designed for performance. It breathes, creaks, and sighs like a memory preserved in steel and silence. From the very first frame, there's a deep sense that this isn't just a setting. It's a character. The setting is a mirror, a map, a living echo chamber where the walls remember more than anyone still walking through them. It doesn't merely hold the story. It shapes it. Everything begins and ends with the factory. Northwood Manufacturing wasn't built for fiction. It wasn't dressed up or painted down. It was an actual, decommissioned steel plant in western Ohio that still wore its history like oil stains on a uniform. When the camera first enters the space, it doesn't glide, it wanders, much like Wendell himself. We are introduced to cracked tiles, rusted beams, and a chill that seems to seep through the lens and into the viewer's bones. Cinematographer Iris Monroe understood that this wasn't a place to light brightly. This was a cathedral of decay, and so she lit it with reverence. Natural light filters through broken windows like ghosts stretching across the floor. Fluorescent bulbs flicker in corners, casting fractured shadows that seem to shift just as you begin to settle. It's beautiful, but not in a glossy, Instagrammed way. It's the kind of beauty that comes from honesty, unfiltered, unfinished, quietly aching. The decision to shoot on location rather than recreate a factory in a studio was more than aesthetic. It was philosophical. Director James Latimer believed the setting needed to have memory. Not just visual texture, but emotional residue. He wanted every wall to whisper, every pipe to groan. He wanted the viewer to feel the weight of time. And they did. Because Northwood wasn't just empty, it was grieving. Its silence wasn't peaceful. It was unsettled. The factory is where Wendell lives, even before he starts sleeping in his van outside. He knows every hallway, every sound. And as the factory empties out, the camera slowly widens its shots. The frames become less crowded. Wendell begins to appear smaller and smaller, dwarfed by the infrastructure around him. It's not subtle. But it's not loud either. The visual storytelling here doesn't scream metaphors. It breathes them. The emptier the factory becomes, the more expansive the frame. Until finally, Wendell is no longer framed within the space. He is consumed by it. The color palette of the film is stripped of any romance. Muted grays, tired browns, faded blues. The world is drained, but never dull. Each tone feels deliberate. Latimer and Monroe worked closely to ensure that the film's visual tone would evolve alongside the emotional arc. In early scenes, when Wendell still clings to routine, the hues lean warm, sunlight kissing the floor, a faint orange glow on his thermos as he sips coffee beside a humming machine. But as the factory winds down, so do the colors. They cool, fade. The warmth recedes like a tide. Even the dust becomes a character. It settles on every surface like a quiet judgment. When Wendell wipes a console clean, it's not just an act of maintenance, it's defiance. A refusal to let time erase what mattered. Outside the factory, the settings maintain that same intimate realism. Wendell's home is a modest, single-story house with faded wallpaper and quiet corners. It's filled with reminders of a life once fuller. A coat still hanging on a hook that hasn't been worn in years, family photos slightly tilted on the wall, a Bible with a cracked spine resting on a nightstand. The house doesn't scream loneliness. It just sits with it. When Wendell starts spending nights in his van, the shift isn't presented as rock bottom. It's presented as inevitability. The van itself becomes its own tiny world. Cluttered, cold, but familiar. The kind of space where memory and regret curl up together in the passenger seat. Several members of the crew swore they heard footsteps in rooms that had already been cleared. Lights would flicker without reason, even though the electrical team swore the circuits were stable. On more than one occasion, radios picked up strange static or voices mid-transmission that weren't part of the crew's chatter. Whether it was imagination or something stranger, no one could say. but they started leaving little offerings near one of the old welding stations: coins, bolts, folded scraps of paper. For the ghosts, someone wrote on a sticky note. It stayed there until Wrap Day. Wright, for his part, leaned into the atmosphere. On his off hours, he would take walks through the plant with no crew, no cameras, just a small flashlight and a leather notebook. He filled pages with thoughts in character, reflections, small imagined memories, dialogue he never spoke aloud. He even took to fixing real things: a loose pipe bracket, a jammed rolling cart, a rusted door hinge. He didn't tell anyone. They just started noticing the place seemed a little more functional each day. One of the greatest challenges the crew faced was the cold. The factory, as beautiful and haunting as it was, had no functioning heat. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was punishing. Breath hung in the air like smoke. Coffee went cold within minutes. Crew members wore thermal layers under their black hoodies, and production assistants handed out hand warmers like candy. Makeup artist Janelle Reese found herself spending more time applying balm to cracked knuckles than powder to faces. But through it all, no one complained. "If Wendell could keep working," a gaffer said, "so could we." The crew's shared suffering bonded them. On particularly cold mornings, Wright would show up with extra thermoses of coffee, brewed in his trailer. He handed them out without ceremony. Just a quiet nod. One for the boom op. One for Maya. One for Monroe, who sometimes lay belly down on freezing concrete to get her camera low enough for a tracking shot. Those moments didn't make headlines, but they stitched the set together like family. Perhaps the most magical moment occurred during the filming of the van scenes. Wright had insisted on using the actual van the crew had found during a location scout, an old rusted-out Dodge sitting in a junkyard 2 towns over. It didn't run. The engine was gone. But they towed it, cleaned it up just enough, and rewired it so it could light up on cue. Wright asked to sleep in it for 3 nights, to feel the confinement, the quiet ache of a man whose world had shrunk to 4 metal walls. He didn't tell anyone the first night. When the crew showed up in the morning and saw his breath on the windows, they knew. During those nights, Wright kept a tape recorder by his side and recorded lines in character. Monologues, prayers, reflections. Some of those recordings made it into the final cut as voiceover, woven into the film like threadbare memories. Wright wasn't the only one who sank deep into the world. Olivia Monette, who played Darla, showed up to set every day in work boots and grease-stained jeans, even when she wasn't filming. She hung around the real mechanics the crew brought in to supervise tool handling. She learned how to use a torque wrench properly. She even fixed a carburetor on her lunch break one day, earning cheers from the entire grip team. When asked why, she simply said, "If I'm going to hand Wendell a wrench, I better damn well know how to use it." The extras, too, brought something unexpected. Many of them were locals, former factory workers, laid off when Northwood closed. They didn't need direction. When asked to perform background tasks, tightening bolts, sweeping floors, they did it like they'd done it for real. Because they had. One man approached Latimer during lunch and said, "I worked here 23 years. Thanks for making us visible again." That moment rippled through the entire crew. It changed how everyone approached the work. This wasn't just a story. This was an elegy. A tribute. On the final night of shooting, after the last take had wrapped, the cast and crew gathered in the old boiler room, Wendell's sanctuary in the story. No speeches. Just quiet. Someone lit a few candles. Someone else played the gospel tape that had become the film's sonic heart. They stood together in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then, one by one, crew members began placing small items on the boiler platform. A wrench. A folded call sheet. A camera battery. A pair of gloves. Each one a memory. An offering. Wright stepped forward last. He placed his thermos down. And without a word, he left. The rest followed. Weeks later, When a location scout returned to Northwood for a separate project, they found all those items untouched, still sitting on the platform like a shrine. Dust had begun to settle. The candles had long since burned out. But the room still held the warmth of something real. Behind the scenes, A Working Man wasn't just about capturing realism on film. It was about living it. About blurring the line between performance and presence. Between fiction and truth. Cast and crew didn't just tell Wendell's story. They carried it with them. And maybe they still do. There's a stillness that lingers long after A Working Man ends. Not the kind of stillness that comes from boredom or finality, but the kind that settles like dust in quiet corners, weighty, earned, and impossible to sweep away. It clings to the viewer's thoughts, gently nudging them into reflection. The film doesn't shout its themes from a mountaintop. Instead, it unfolds them slowly, like a work shirt pressed and buttoned by a man who's done it every day for 30 years. Fold by fold, the ideas reveal themselves, not with force, but with familiarity. At its core, A Working Man is a meditation on purpose. Not in the romanticized, follow-your-passion sense, but in the deeply grounded, boots-on-concrete way that defines so many lives. For Wendell Graves, purpose isn't abstract. It's the ticking of the punch clock, the hum of machinery under his fingertips, the satisfaction of a pipe no longer leaking. His identity is not built on words or aspirations. It's built on work. Real, tangible, necessary work. And so, when that work is stripped away, it isn't just a job that dies. It's him. The film explores this erosion with deliberate, agonizing care. The slow dismantling of the factory, the loss of colleagues, the dimming of lights, the silence where there used to be footsteps, isn't just the background noise of industrial decline. It's the physical manifestation of Wendell's internal unraveling. The factory is his mirror, and as each hallway empties, we see him shrink a little more. The symbolism here is subtle but devastating. The vanishing workspace is a vanishing self. And yet, within that loss, the film plants a deeper idea, that dignity is not something given by society, but carried by the individual. Wendell continues to show up after he's been let go. He cleans. He fixes. He keeps the machines alive. Not because anyone asks him to. Not because it will change anything. But because it's right. Because in doing so, he holds onto his sense of worth, threadbare as it may be. The world may not be watching, but his soul is. This idea, the sanctity of unseen labor, is one of the film's most resonant themes. We live in an era obsessed with visibility, with recognition, with metrics and likes. But A Working Man offers a quiet counter-narrative, that the most profound acts of integrity often happen in the dark, unnoticed. Wendell's work is sacred not because it's acknowledged, but because it's done with care. The camera doesn't dramatize these moments. It sits with them. A man tightening a bolt becomes a sermon. A man wiping grease off a control panel becomes an elegy. The film also speaks to intergenerational disconnect, a theme that emerges in the relationship between Wendell and his daughter, Tasha. She's pragmatic, educated, forward-thinking. She sees the writing on the wall and wants her father to adapt, to rest, to move on. But Wendell lives in a world where you are what you do, and to stop working would be to vanish. Their tension is quiet but sharp. And in that dynamic lies another layer of thematic richness. The shifting meaning of masculinity, responsibility, and what it means to provide in a world that no longer values the kind of labor Wendell built his life on. There's a pivotal moment when Tasha confronts him about the eviction. She's angry, heartbroken, confused. But what she doesn't understand, and what the film never fully spells out, because it trusts the audience, is that Wendell didn't tell her not out of pride, but out of love. He wanted to protect her from the shame he carried. It's an old kind of love. Wordless, stoic, and deeply misunderstood. Through this, the film quietly critiques the emotional suppression so often instilled in working-class men. It shows the cost of silence. the damage of shouldering too much, too long. Symbolism flows through the film like oil through old pipes, coarse, hidden, essential. The factory itself is the most obvious symbol. It stands not just for labor, but for legacy, for community, for memory. And when it begins to decay, it echoes the broader collapse of middle-class identity in America's industrial heartland. But there are more personal symbols, too. The thermos Wendell carries is no ordinary prop. It's a tether, to routine, to history, to the man he used to be. He carries it like a relic, sips from it like communion. In one scene, when he leaves it behind accidentally, the sense of panic in his face is startling. Not because he's lost an object, but because he's lost a part of himself. That thermos, scratched and dented, is his anchor in a world adrift. The van, too, takes on profound symbolic weight. It's not just a shelter, it's a coffin on wheels, a cocoon, a confession booth. When Wendell begins sleeping in it, he's not just homeless. He's entombed in the shell of his former life. The film never shows him crying in that van. But it doesn't have to. The way he folds his coat, the way he clicks the tape player, the way he stares out the fogged windshield into nothing. That's grief. That's surrender. And yet, there's redemption in the smallest places. The garage where Darla gives him a second chance isn't framed as a miracle. It's greasy, chaotic, loud. But it's alive. It represents the possibility of rebirth, not flashy, not easy, but real. The shop is a counterpoint to the factory. Where the plant was large and empty, the shop is small and full. Where the factory echoed with what once was, the shop hums with what could be. It's not glamorous, but it's present. And so is Wendell, for the first time in a long while. The film also explores the theme of invisibility, particularly as it applies to aging workers. Wendell isn't fired with cruelty. He's phased out, forgotten, made obsolete by automation and policy. The film doesn't villainize this, it simply presents it. But in doing so, it forces the audience to confront the quiet erasure that happens when value is tied solely to productivity. Wendell isn't unique. He's one of many. And that's the heartbreak. He's extraordinary only in how long he refuses to vanish. The use of space in the film furthers this idea. Early scenes frame Wendell tightly, at his workbench, in stairwells, among machines. But as the story progresses, the shots widen. He becomes a figure swallowed by shadow and steel. The more he's cast aside, the more space opens around him. And in that space, we feel his fading. Not in words. In absence. There's also the tape. That gospel cassette Wendell plays in his van is the film's only recurring music cue, and it's used with surgical precision. Warbled and barely audible, the song becomes a lullaby, a time machine, a prayer. It's tied to memory, perhaps his wife, perhaps his childhood. We're never told. But we know. It's the sound of something true. Something that cannot be automated or replaced. A soul rendered in song. And when it plays, it fills the van with more warmth than the old heater ever could. Throughout all this, the film resists sentimentality. It doesn't beg for tears. It doesn't offer triumphs wrapped in bows. Its ultimate message isn't that Wendell saves the factory, or finds riches, or even gets the recognition he deserves. Instead, it offers something more valuable: acknowledgement. Darla sees him. Tasha understands him, finally. Luis, the young apprentice, carries his teachings forward. Wendell doesn't change the world. But he is changed, by connection, by memory, by the choice to keep showing up. That, perhaps, is the most powerful theme of all. Resilience. Not the Hollywood kind, where heroes rise and overcome and deliver rousing speeches. But the quiet kind. The kind that looks like a man fixing a pipe no one will ever see. The kind that folds laundry in the dark and shows up to work when the pay's long gone. The kind that doesn't ask for applause, just a little space to keep going. In that way, A Working Man becomes more than a film. It becomes a prayer, a portrait, a whispered reminder that there is worth in the overlooked, dignity in the unspoken, and hope, even if quiet, even if cracked, still flickers in the most unexpected places. The film closes not with an anthem, but with a breath, a sigh, a new day. Wendell opens the garage. The light shifts, and we understand. He's still here. And that, in itself, is everything. There was something about the way the camera lingered, just a second longer than most films would dare, that made A Working Man feel like more than just a movie. It breathed. It didn't demand your attention. It invited you to sit still, to lean into the silence, to observe instead of react. The filmmaking wasn't flashy. No sweeping crane shots. No whip pans. No jittery edits begging for emotion. Instead, it trusted the world it built. It trusted the audience. And it built everything, frame by frame, sound by sound, with the patience of a craftsman. Director James Latimer and cinematographer Iris Monroe knew exactly what kind of film they were making. This wasn't a story that needed dramatic stylization. It needed truth, grit, and restraint. The factory, the rusting skeleton of a forgotten steel plant in Ohio, didn't need dressing up. It needed to be honored. Monroe approached the space not like a location, but like a character. She studied how light crept through broken windows at different hours of the day, how shadows moved across cracked linoleum as time passed. She didn't bring massive lighting rigs. She brought patience. Many of the scenes were shot using available light. It wasn't a budgetary constraint, it was a creative choice. Natural shafts of sun filtering through dust became spotlights. Flickering fluorescent bulbs cast uneven hues that made everything feel off-kilter, tired, true. This allowed Monroe to capture the world as Wendell would see it, not dressed up, not filtered, just real. And that reality became one of the film's strongest anchors. The choice of lenses also played a crucial role. Wide-angle lenses were used not to distort but to emphasize space, the empty break room, the stretching factory floor, the long, lonely walk between rows of silent machines. They didn't exaggerate. They exposed. You felt the size of Wendell's world, and how small he was within it. As the story progressed, the compositions shifted subtly. Early on, Wendell is placed in the center of the frame, grounded, stable. But as the factory winds down, he's pushed to the edges. Left of center. Sometimes almost out of sight. It's unconscious at first, but by the final act, you realize, the world he built his life around is slowly ejecting him. Latimer's direction was nearly invisible, and that's meant as the highest compliment. He didn't impose a style. He dissolved into the environment. He let scenes unfold organically, allowing silences to stretch, glances to hang. One of the most emotionally charged scenes, Wendell sitting in his van, listening to the warbled gospel tape, was shot in a single take, with no dialogue and minimal camera movement. Just a static shot, the frame held for almost 3 minutes. It was a risky move, but it paid off. Audiences leaned in. They felt that moment, because nothing was telling them how to feel. They were just there. The editing, by longtime Latimer collaborator Danica Reyes, followed the same ethos. Cuts were deliberate, sparse, and purposeful. There were no montages, no crash cuts or artificial rhythms. Instead, Reyes let scenes play out in their own time, often using long dissolves or fade-outs to create the sensation of time slipping by, not as a dramatic beat, but as life's natural rhythm. Transitions were often sound-led, with a hiss of machinery or the faint clang of metal leading us from one moment to the next. This helped build a sense of continuity, a feeling that even when Wendell wasn't on screen, the world he lived in kept moving, kept aging, kept forgetting. One of the film's most innovative techniques was its approach to sound. There was no traditional score for 80% of the runtime. That wasn't because they couldn't afford one. It was because they didn't need one. Sound designer Rachel Ng treated the factory like a living instrument. She spent weeks recording ambient noise, pipes moaning, wind howling through broken windows, the subtle tick of cooling metal. She layered these sounds underneath scenes like a heartbeat. Not to manipulate emotion, but to reflect it. The factory spoke in tones. You just had to listen. And when music did arrive, often in the form of the old gospel cassette Wendell plays in his van, it felt like a bomb. Soft, crackling, imperfect. The tape itself had no title. It was found by the props team in a box of real lost and found items from the abandoned factory. Latimer fell in love with it immediately. Ng remastered the tape just enough to make it audible, but left all the warping, all the static. When it played, it wasn't just a song. It was memory, grief, hope. There was one moment, buried in the middle of the film, that exemplified the harmony of visual and sound design. Wendell, alone in the maintenance room, turns off the last machine. The whir stops. Then a faint ringing. Then silence. The camera holds on his face, expressionless but heavy. And then, in the distance, a bird chirps. Just one. That sound, simple, soft, almost accidental, feels like a dagger. It's the sound of the world moving on. And Wendell hearing it for the first time. Even the color grading was designed to echo emotional beats. Early scenes are warm, amber lights, soft browns, the faded yellow of factory paint. As Wendell begins to unravel, the palette cools. Blues creep in. Grays dominate. By the time he's sleeping in his van, the world feels washed out. Desaturated. But then, when he steps into Darla's garage, the place of renewal, the warmth returns. Not fully, but enough. A beam of sun. A red toolbox. A glint in his eye. The color doesn't shout. It hints. It's no surprise that audiences who watched the film often came away feeling like they'd lived inside it. That was the goal. To immerse without overwhelming. To build a sensory experience so cohesive, so carefully textured, that you didn't notice the techniques until after the credits rolled. The choices were invisible, but their impact was undeniable. Of course, bringing such a quiet story to life came with its challenges. The biggest, convincing producers to back it in the first place. The original pitch was rejected multiple times. Studios said it was too small, too slow, too bleak. But independent distributor Emberline Pictures, known for championing grounded dramas, saw its potential. They greenlit it on a modest $4 million budget, half of which went to location costs, insurance for the aging factory, and Jeffrey Wright's salary, though he took a pay cut to make the film.